The office was quiet, the hum of computers and the soft click of keyboards filling the air. It was a professional space, one where business was done with efficiency and precision. Glass walls, sleek furniture, and well-organized desks spoke volumes about the company that ran inside these walls. But the man who owned it all? He walked with an air of calm, not seeking attention, not demanding respect. Michael. Michael was in his 40s, dressed in a simple yet sharp suit. He was the kind of man who didn't flaunt his wealth or success. He didn't need to. His reputation preceded him, but he preferred to keep things understated. There was a quiet strength in him, an ability to lead without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He was a successful businessman, but that was not what defined him. He was defined by his actions, not his title, not his bank account. Across the office, John walked in. The sound of his boots echoed on the marble floors as he made his way toward the front desk, his uniform stiff with pride. In his mid-30s, John had already been a police officer for over a decade. His badge was more than just an accessory. It was a shield. And to him, that shield gave him power. Not just power to protect and serve, but power over people, power to make others feel small. John was confident, maybe even a bit too confident. He believed his badge made him better than most. People in uniforms like his were supposed to be respected, feared even. And that's how John carried himself. He never shied away from letting others know who was in charge. Today, as John strolled into Michael's office building, he carried that same arrogance with him. He had no idea who Michael was, but he assumed he knew enough. The quiet, reserved man who sat at his desk couldn't possibly be someone important, right? John approached the front desk where one of the employees greeted him. "Good morning, officer. Can I help you with something?" John flashed a smile, a mix of charm and superiority. "Just here for a quick check-in. I'll head to the back." He walked past the receptionist, the faint sound of his boots echoing through the otherwise silent hall. But as he made his way toward the conference room, he noticed something strange. The way the employees around him stood a little taller when they passed by Michael's office. There was an aura of respect there. But John didn't think much of it. After all, he was John, the officer who kept the streets safe. As he walked into the conference room, he caught sight of Michael sitting at the head of a long, polished table, focused on his work. The man looked ordinary enough, but John's gaze lingered. Something felt different. John couldn't place it, but he didn't let it bother him. He had bigger things to focus on. For now, the calm of the office would be disrupted. What neither of them knew was that today would change everything, not just for them, but for everyone in that office. A moment of arrogance would soon collide with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be underestimated. And this was only the beginning. Michael sat at his desk, his eyes focused on the glowing screen in front of him. A detailed project plan laid out in front of him. The office was quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of the air conditioning and the gentle tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. He'd been deep in thought all morning, working to finalize some important contracts. But the peace wouldn't last for long. The door to the office opened with a slight creak. Michael didn't look up. He was used to people coming in and out of the building, but when he heard the confident, almost cocky footsteps approaching, he knew who it was. John, the police officer who often popped in for various business-related checks. Michael wasn't sure why John was there today, but he didn't pay much attention. John walked in with his usual swagger, a small smirk on his face as he made his way toward Michael's desk. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming in the light. He stood a little taller than most people, walking like he owned the space around him. "Hey there," John said, his voice loud enough to draw attention, as if he wanted to make sure everyone knew he was in the room. "Busy day, huh?" Michael looked up briefly, offering a polite but reserved smile. "Yes, just working on some final details." John chuckled lightly, leaning against the edge of Michael's desk, his tone turning more casual. almost condescending. "I gotta say, man, I don't know how you do it. Sitting in here all day working on, what is it? Papers? Numbers?" He waved his hand dismissively, as if the work Michael did was beneath him. "Must be nice, right? No real responsibility. Just pushing around paperwork all day." Michael didn't react. His eyes remained steady on the screen in front of him, fingers still tapping at the keyboard. He knew this was the beginning of another one of John's attempts to belittle him. It wasn't the first time. John, sensing Michael's lack of reaction, pushed further, his voice carrying a slight edge now. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough so the others in the office could hear, "you're pretty quiet for someone who runs this place. I mean, most guys with a real job, a real career, they'd be a little more vocal, right? Not just hiding behind a desk." Michael glanced up at him, his gaze calm but firm. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself." But John wasn't finished. He wasn't going to let the silence win. Right. Let your work speak. But let's be real here. What you do doesn't exactly sound like something worth bragging about. I mean, you're not out there, saving lives or doing something important, right?" He said the word important, as though the idea of working in an office was a joke. "You know, you could be doing something a lot more exciting. Maybe if you weren't so quiet, you'd get noticed more." The words stung, but Michael didn't flinch. He simply returned to his project, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, as though John wasn't even there. The more Michael ignored him, the more John pushed, as if his silence was some sort of victory. John, clearly enjoying his small victory, threw in one last comment for the room to hear, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Must be nice, though, to get paid for doing practically nothing. Not everyone gets to sit around in a quiet office pretending they're running things." A few of the other employees glanced over, uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Michael remained unmoved, his expression unchanged. His silence was deliberate. He refused to give John the satisfaction of a response, but to John, this silence was victory. "See? This is why I can't respect guys like you," John said, laughing under his breath. "No backbone, just plain pretend. You're not even worth the time, man." The words hung in the air, but Michael didn't bite. He didn't react, didn't even acknowledge the jab. His focus was unbroken, and that was enough to make John feel the smallest sting of doubt. After a few moments, John straightened up, a smug smile on his face, and with one last glance at Michael's unshaken demeanor, he walked away, his footsteps once again loud in the otherwise quiet room. Michael didn't look up as John left. He didn't need to. The silence had been his answer, and in that moment, it had been enough. John, however, walked away with a feeling of superiority. He had made his point in his mind. He had shown Michael who was in charge. Little did he know, the true power was never in the words spoken, but in the silence that followed. And today, Michael's silence spoke louder than any comeback ever could. The conference room was filled with the low murmur of conversation as employees gathered for the monthly office-wide meeting. Michael was at the head of the long table, sitting as quietly as usual, his laptop open in front of him. It was just another regular day, or so it seemed. John entered the room with his usual stride, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming as always. He nodded at the employees around him, settling into his seat with a casual air. He was still riding high on the small victory he'd felt from his earlier encounter with Michael. He figured he had already proven that Michael was just another regular guy who couldn't possibly be important. After all, Michael barely said a word during their earlier interaction, just as he always did. It had been easy to dismiss him. The meeting began, as usual. Michael spoke with a calm tone, outlining some updates for the team. His voice was measured, his words straightforward. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. The tension in the room was subtle, but it was there. The quiet anticipation that something was about to unfold. Michael paused, glancing around the room. The light from the windows reflected off his glasses, casting a brief shadow over his face. He closed his laptop and stood up. The room fell into silence, all eyes turning to him. Michael, always composed, didn't rush. He waited for the room to settle before he spoke again. "There's something I need to share with all of you," he began, his voice calm and steady. "Something I think is important for you to know." The room waited, but the air felt heavier now. Employees exchanged confused glances, wondering what was coming next. John, who had been half-heartedly listening, raised an eyebrow. This wasn't like Michael. He wasn't one to draw attention to himself. Michael took a deep breath before continuing, his eyes scanning the room. "I am the owner of this company," he said simply. The words hit like a bombshell. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire room was frozen, as if time had stopped. The air seemed to grow thick with disbelief. Employees who had known Michael for years, who had worked alongside him every day, looked at each other in stunned silence. They had no idea. But it was John's reaction that was most telling. His mouth went dry, his eyes widening. His brain struggled to process the information. The man he had been mocking, the man he had belittled in front of the others just hours ago, was not just an employee. He was the one who owned the building, the one who called the shots. John's face flushed with embarrassment, his confidence crumbling in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He blinked a few times, still in shock, as if trying to convince himself that he hadn't just heard what he thought he heard. The realization hit him hard. All of his earlier comments, the sarcastic jabs, the jokes about Michael's simple job, the dismissive remarks about his career, now seemed like nothing more than foolish arrogance. He had thought he was talking to just another office worker, but in reality he had been speaking to the very person who owned the company he had been walking into every day. Michael wasn't just another regular guy. He was the one who made the decisions. He was the one who had built the empire that John had underestimated. And in that moment, as John sat frozen in his chair, his entire perception of the world around him shifted. The room remained silent, the weight of Michael's revelation hanging in the air. No one knew how to react. The employees were still processing, their eyes flicking between Michael and John, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Michael, for his part, remained calm. His gaze moved slowly over the room, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no smugness. It wasn't about proving a point. It was simply a matter of truth. "I don't expect you to have known," Michael continued, his tone gentle but firm. "But I think it's important that everyone knows who's leading them. Leadership isn't about authority. It's about respect. And I hope you all understand that moving forward." John's stomach turned. He felt a deep sense of shame, but it was more than just being caught in his arrogance. It was the realization that he had been completely blind to Michael's quiet power, to the fact that Michael had been leading by example all along. John's mind raced, replaying their earlier conversation, the jokes he'd made, the dismissive comments about Michael's simple job. He felt small. He felt ridiculous. How could he have been so blind? The man he had thought of as just another office worker was, in fact, his superior. The man he had mocked was the one who could have easily made his life difficult, and yet he hadn't. Michael had simply let his silence speak for itself. For a moment, John couldn't look anyone in the eye. His hands were cold, his pulse quickened. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. How could he apologize for something so foolish? Michael turned and started walking toward the door, his calm demeanor unshaken by the shocked reactions around him. As he reached the door, he paused for just a moment, his voice carrying just enough for John to hear. Let's all remember that what matters isn't the title or the badge, but how we treat one another, Michael said before exiting the room, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. John sat there, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. He had underestimated Michael. Worse, he had humiliated him in front of others. And now, he realized how wrong he had been. His earlier words felt like a slap to the face, and there was no taking them back. The truth was undeniable. Michael wasn't just the owner of the company. He was a man who understood the real meaning of power. And it wasn't about authority. It was about how you made others feel. And for John, that lesson had come too late. The following day, the tension in the office was palpable. Whispers filled the air as employees exchanged glances, still processing Michael's shocking revelation. But John couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. His mind replayed the events over and over, and with each repetition, the shame grew heavier. He had misjudged Michael in the worst possible way. John walked into the office that morning, his usual confidence replaced by a sense of discomfort. His uniform felt heavier than usual, his movements stiff. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment Michael had stood in front of everyone and revealed the truth. The man he had ridiculed was the one who had silently watched over everything, holding the power in his hands the whole time. As John passed through the office, he saw Michael sitting at his desk, as composed and calm as always. The sight of Michael's quiet strength only made John feel more uneasy. He walked past Michael's office, avoiding eye contact, but he knew that he couldn't let this go. He needed to face Michael. He needed to apologize. Taking a deep breath, John turned around and walked into Michael's office. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting John's with that same calm, steady gaze. There was no judgment, no anger, just silence. John hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Finally he spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Michael, I need to talk to you." Michael didn't respond immediately. He simply motioned for John to sit across from him, his expression unreadable. John sat down slowly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. After a moment of silence, Michael spoke, his voice steady but firm. "I'm listening." John swallowed hard. The words felt heavy, but they needed to be said. I was wrong," he started. "I've been wrong about you. The things I said, the way I treated you. I thought you were just another office worker. I didn't know who you really were. I didn't know your story. I assumed things about you based on where I thought you were in life. I assumed you were insignificant. But I was wrong." Michael's eyes didn't leave John's face. He sat back in his chair, his posture still relaxed, but somehow imposing. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. Michael wasn't going to interrupt. He wasn't going to jump in and fix the situation. He was letting John process it all. John continued, the words coming out in a rush now. "I shouldn't have treated you like that. I shouldn't have made those jokes about your job. I shouldn't have assumed that because you were quiet, you weren't important. I was an idiot." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze soft but unyielding. "You judged me because you saw a man in a simple office, but you didn't know the story behind me." His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Success isn't loud. It's not always about flashy titles. Sometimes it's quiet strength." John's chest tightened. Michael's words hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Michael wasn't angry. He wasn't out to punish John. But the calm certainty in his voice spoke volumes. "You're right," John said, his voice catching. "I treated you like you were beneath me. I assumed that because I wore a badge and walked into rooms with authority, I had the right to belittle anyone I thought was below me. But I was wrong. I've been wrong all along." Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes still steady. We all make assumptions about people. We see the outside, and we think we know who they are. But we don't know the story behind the person. We don't know what they've been through or what they've accomplished. You're not the first to treat me like I'm just an office worker based on the way I dress or the way I carry myself. But that doesn't change who I am, or the work I've done to get here. John was silent for a moment, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. He felt a deep wave of guilt wash over him, far deeper than the embarrassment he'd felt in the meeting room the day before. He had used his badge, his position, as a weapon. He had used it to intimidate and belittle someone he didn't understand, someone who had quietly achieved more than John could have ever imagined. "I can't change what I did," John said, the guilt evident in his voice. "But I want to be better. I don't want to be the kind of person who looks down on others anymore. I want to be someone who earns respect, not demands it. I know I've got a long way to go, but I want to learn from this." Michael sat back, considering John's words. For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice quiet but unwavering. "We all have room to grow, but growth doesn't come from making others feel small. It comes from lifting others up, from respecting them for who they are, not for what we think they are. True strength comes from within, not from a title or position." John nodded slowly, taking in every word. For the first time in a long while, he truly understood what Michael meant. He realized that power wasn't in making people feel weak. It was in empowering them to be strong. And that was something he had failed to do. Until now. "I'll do better," John said finally, his voice more confident, but still carrying the weight of the lesson he'd just learned. "I promise." Michael nodded. "I believe you." There was a long pause before John stood up to leave, but before he walked out the door, he turned to Michael one last time. "I'm sorry, Michael. I never should have treated you like that. Thank you for showing me a different way." Michael smiled slightly, a small but genuine smile. "You're welcome. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." And with that, John left the room, feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight of his arrogance, the guilt of his past actions, had started to lift. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he was determined to change. Michael's quiet strength had humbled him in a way that no reprimand ever could. And now, John had a new understanding, one that would change the way he looked at others, and the way he carried himself, forever. Weeks passed, and the office began to feel like a different place. The tension that had followed Michael's revelation slowly started to dissipate. But for John, the weight of his actions lingered, gnawing at him every day. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he'd had with Michael in that quiet office. The words Michael had spoken, the lessons he had imparted. John couldn't help but reflect on how wrong he had been. He had assumed power came from his badge, from his uniform, from the title that he wore. But the true power, the kind that commanded respect, wasn't about authority. It was about respect itself. John spent days thinking over every word of their conversation, the guilt building each time he remembered the way he had belittled Michael. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions weren't just about treating Michael poorly. It was about how he had treated others in the past, how he had used his position to impose fear rather than understanding. The shift in him wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. John began to change, little by little. He started treating people with more care, listening to them, respecting their opinions. He noticed the way his colleagues responded when he genuinely took an interest in their work, when he valued them for who they were, not just the roles they played. But there was one thing that John knew he still had to do. He had to make things right with Michael. He couldn't let the weight of his mistakes go unaddressed. He needed to apologize properly, to show Michael that he had learned from his actions. One afternoon, John walked into Michael's office again, his heart pounding. This time there was no bravado in his step, no cocky smile. There was only a quiet determination. Michael was at his desk as usual, working silently. When he saw John, he glanced up, not with suspicion, but with the same calm, composed expression that John had come to admire. He didn't say anything at first, just waiting. John stood in the doorway for a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Michael," he began, his voice steady but sincere, "I need to apologize. I've been carrying around a lot of guilt for the way I treated you, and I realize now how wrong I was. I judged you based on what I saw, based on my own ego, and I let that cloud my judgment. I used my position to make you feel small, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." Michael didn't say anything right away. He simply studied John, his expression unreadable. John could feel the weight of the apology hanging between them, but Michael didn't rush to answer. After a long moment, Michael finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Apologizing is the first step, John," he said. "But it's what you do after that matters. I don't hold a grudge, but I do want you to remember that leadership isn't about power. It's not about looking down on people. It's about understanding them, respecting them, and empowering them." John nodded, his chest tightening. He had heard these words before, but now they felt different. They resonated with him in a way they hadn't before. "I've learned that," John said quietly, "and I'm trying to be better, to treat people with more humility, more respect. You were right. Power doesn't come from the badge or the uniform. It comes from how you treat others." Michael smiled slightly, a small but genuine smile. "I can see that, and that's all I can ask for." John felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He knew that apologizing to Michael wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Michael had shown him what true leadership looked like. It wasn't about commanding respect. It was about earning it through understanding, empathy, and humility. As the days went on, John became more conscious of how he interacted with others. He took the time to listen to people, to genuinely care about their thoughts and experiences. He stopped relying on his uniform to gain respect. Instead, he focused on being someone people could trust, someone who led by example, not by force. The change was gradual, but noticeable. John's colleagues began to see a different side of him, one that wasn't driven by pride or arrogance, but by a desire to connect and uplift others. He made an effort to recognize the strengths of those around him, to give credit where it was due, and to offer support when needed. He didn't just want to be respected anymore. He wanted to earn that respect, day by day, through his actions. But through it all, one lesson stood out above the rest, the lesson that Michael had taught him. True leadership wasn't about what you wore or what you owned. It wasn't about the power you held over others. It was about how you made others feel, how you empowered them, and how you inspired them to be better. John knew he wasn't perfect, and he didn't expect to be. But he had learned something invaluable. Leadership was about humility, and respect was earned, not demanded. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And as for Michael, he continued to lead in his own quiet way, showing by example that true power wasn't in taking control. It was in lifting others up. And that lesson had not only changed John's life, it had changed the culture of the office, one small action at a time. As the weeks turned into months, life at the office slowly returned to normal. But for both Michael and John, everything had changed. Michael continued to run his business with the same quiet grace and strength that had always defined him. He didn't need to flaunt his success or authority. His leadership spoke for itself. His calm demeanor, his respect for others, and his genuine humility were enough to inspire those around him. Michael was a reminder that true power doesn't demand attention. It commands respect through action, not words. John, on the other hand, had undergone a transformation. The arrogance that had once defined him had given way to a more thoughtful, humble approach to his work. He no longer saw his badge as a symbol of power, but as a tool to serve and protect. He began to approach his job with more respect for others, listening to his colleagues, understanding their challenges, and offering support wherever he could. What once felt like an endless pursuit of control had now become a mission to uplift, to be the kind of leader who inspired those around him through empathy and humility. The change wasn't dramatic or instant, but it was real. John learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one with the most authority. It was about recognizing the value in everyone, regardless of their role, and empowering them to succeed. It was about respecting others, not based on their outward appearances or titles, but for the person they truly were. The lessons that Michael had unknowingly taught him, lessons about humility, respect, and strength, shaped the way John now saw the world. He no longer felt the need to prove himself. He didn't need to belittle others to feel better about his position. Instead, he began to see that true strength came from lifting others up, not putting them down. And Michael, despite the humility that defined him, remained a quiet force in John's life. His example was something John would never forget. Michael had shown him that true success wasn't about how much you had or how high you climbed. It was about how you treated others along the way. True power isn't in how loudly you speak or how much you can control. It's in how much you can uplift others, no matter who they are. In the end, it wasn't Michael's title or John's badge that mattered. What mattered was how they treated each other and how they treated the people around them. Power, real power, is never about dominating others. It's about recognizing their worth, inspiring them to be their best, and in doing so, becoming the best version of yourself. So the next time you meet someone, remember, you don't always know their story. Don't judge based on appearances, titles, or assumptions. True strength is found in the quiet strength of character, in humility, and in the ability to see the value in everyone. And that is the kind of strength that changes lives.